Hello.
Hello, hello.
How are you doing today?
I am doing excellent.
Good to hear it. Okay, so what we've got today is a podcast from the London School of Economics, and I guess we're gonna hear what they have to say about corruption. I have not listened to any of their podcasts before. I just thought the title was a provocative, interesting question, and so I guess I'd like to hear what they've got to say. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'm not the most familiar with the London School of Economics, but my understanding is they are very highly regarded. So I'm really excited to hear what they have to say because corruption is one of those things. It feels like one of those problems where people talk about it angrily, but it doesn't feel like there's any super good solutions that are like out there in the ether. And it's something that is a huge like malaise, especially on like in third world countries. And then dealing with those third world countries is really interesting. There was a very famous scandal in Canada about a Canadian company that essentially was bribing was bribing these third world governments. I believe it was the MC Lavalin scandal. And essentially the Canadian government, this was a huge construction company. The Canadian government canceled basically the claim was that the Canadian government canceled the investigation to this construction company of their bribery, and it was sort of this corruption. It was sort of this back and forth of, oh, well, on the one hand, you just can't do business in this part of the world without doing bribes. But on the other hand, does that mean we should necessarily look the other way for these companies? So, really interesting stuff. I'm excited to hear about it. And obviously, gosh, it's funny. How does this relate to modern politics? Oh, yes, the MC Lavalin scandal from 2019. Everyone knows about that. Much more obviously, Hunter Biden and Burisma and all that stuff in Ukraine. So, that would be the actual more relevant connection, probably.
We've
Really looking
done
forward to
one
it.
other show on corruption before, and it was the Perun video about
Mhm.
Vladimir Putin's regime and like the which alleges that there's a big culture of corruption there. So yeah, like you said earlier, you were saying something about like it's one of those issues where it seems hard to do anything about it, but I sort of feel like it's I think the way I would rather put it is it's one of those issues where you have to settle for doing things about it incrementally, right? It's
Yeah.
not you can't like exterminate corruption, but you can reduce it is would be like my initial opinion going into this. So I would think that some amount of corruption is inevitable, but widespread corruption probably not inevitable. That's my
Mhm.
initial opinion. And then whenever you're ready to stream it,
Oh, yep. Sorry. I once again almost started. I started playing it without first sharing my screen once again. Here we go. Let's do that. And okay, now it should be good to go.
I'm Jess Winterstein, and this is the podcast where we ask
can we turn
leading
it
social
back up a little
scientists
bit?
and
Sorry.
other experts to answer an
Sorry,
intelligent
what was that?
Oh, I was just asking for the volume to be turned up a little bit.
Oh, yeah. No problem.
Thank you.
question. Bribery, extortion, cronyism, nepotism, influence peddling, embezzlement. Corruption comes in many forms and with varying levels of legality. According to the global NGO Transparency International, illicit financial flows, including bribery, theft, and tax evasion, cost developing countries more than 1.26 trillion US dollars per year. The EU Commissioner for Home Affairs has estimated that its member states alone lose 120 billion euros to corruption annually. Corruption might have the greatest impact on the world's poorest countries, but it is a universal problem that in some way or other touches us all. In this episode, I explore the question, is corruption inevitable?
Right now, we know that the biggest disease of all is not a disease. It's corruption. But there's a vaccine for that too. It's called transparency, open data sets.
This is a delicate thing to say to a group of leaders in their House of Parliament, but you have to fight the cancer of corruption.
Corruption destroys a country. It destroys state institutions. It destroys money, the human development, because money meant for human beings ends up in people's pockets. It causes money laundering, which puts pressure on your currency, which devalues, which means inflation. So I came to fight against corruption.
A disease, a cancer, a destroyer of countries. From rock stars to world leaders, the general consensus is that corruption is disastrous, causing great damage to a nation's economic prosperity and its reputation. So why then, despite the regular pledges of governments around the world to combat it, does corruption still flourish?
What we label corruption from our perspective, living in the Western world here, is in many ways how we've always lived our lives. It's a more natural way of being. We just label it corruption from this kind of modern standpoint.
That was Dr. Michael Muthukrishna, Assistant Professor of Economic Psychology at LSE. Michael's research explores a variety of related topics, including innovation, corruption, and the rise of large-scale cooperation. While one might consider corrupt behaviour as a dishonest act carried out for personal profit or advantage, Michael takes the view that corruption is more the result of a biological drive that we all share.
There's a big puzzle in evolutionary biology, and it's the puzzle of cooperation. So why is it that any organism would give up its self-interest for the interest of a larger group of individuals? So self-interest for the group. And it's a difficult puzzle. It's a difficult problem to solve. In fact, it's so difficult that Science Magazine in 2005 listed it as one of its 125 big questions for the coming decades. So what I've done is to take all of this work that's been done on cooperation, this framework for understanding how it is that organisms, humans included, work with one another, and applied it to this puzzle of corruption that exists in the political and economic sphere.
Michael argues that although corruption might appear to be a breakdown in cooperation, in fact, corruption is cooperation. I asked him to explain.
The kind of smallest scale of cooperation above an individual is groups of families, groups of related individuals working with one another, right? And we have a framework for understanding. It's called inclusive fitness or kin selection. And it's kind of the equals MC squared of evolutionary biology, that if the relatedness times the benefit is going to be greater than the cost to yourself, then genes that can identify and favor copies of themselves, according to this rule, will spread at the expense of those that don't. So you will be more likely to help your sister than you are to help your cousin, and more likely to help your cousin than to help a much more distant relative.
So nepotism is just a natural way that we've evolved.
Exactly. So what we call, if a president were to give a favor to his daughter, for example, we would call this nepotism. But actually, it's just inclusive fitness undermining our institutions. And so you can do this for kind of every kind and every scale of cooperation. So you might not like your office.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I've got a couple of things to say here. One of which is I was kind of amused by this idea they brought up that that cooperation among animals is one of the biggest puzzles in biology, because that seems so unintuitive to me, because the benefits of cooperation just seem really obvious, but it makes me wonder, like, is there some reason that this is more difficult than I think, which probably must be the answer, or is it just that, like, they're struggling to find a way to fit it into their framework and find an explanation for it? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, man, evolution is one of those things where it's really, really complicated, so I always want to tread carefully. But I think there's this misnomer sometimes that evolution is like this intentional system that's like optimizing, when really it's just random effect and the world selecting for certain things. Mm-hmm. It's funny. The description they gave is exactly right. The gene selects for self-preservation. But it's funny, in my notes, I almost wrote it down as this, and then I redid the notes because it was a little snarky. But it's like, yeah, genes that are better at propagating are the ones that propagate. Where, a lot of these adaptations are just things that are just random and just happen to work out better. So I think when it comes to the cooperation thing, it makes sense why that would be more effective. The thing that I think has always been puzzling to me, and my, again, very limited understanding is a lot of this they still don't really understand, is how do you get specific traits like that in the first place, like the mutations or the evolutions to encourage the brain structure of an animal. I mean, we still know so little about even the human brain, let alone animal brain. So I that's always been the greatest source of sort of like curiosity for me, is like, is this like a multi-step process where you're incrementally building? I mean, obviously it is to some degree. What is the biggest individual step? Do you just go one day, there's some gene that causes the receptor in the brain, a certain kind of receptor along our neural pathways, to alter slightly, and that just encourages more cooperation? Those specific details are the thing that always gets me.
Yeah, so I don't know enough about biology to answer the question very specifically, but it just I don't know. Like to me, this doesn't sound like that difficult of a question. Just because if you have an animal that's docile, or that I guess maybe not even necessarily docile generally, but just an animal that has a wide repertoire of behaviors, and some of those are docile, and so it can learn to be like selectively docile in appropriate circumstances with things that are not dangerous to it. I mean, it seems to me like that's all it would take is just to learn that others of your kind are not particularly a threat. And I mean, there are even insects that do this, right?
Hmm. Yeah, I guess it's just the question of like, I guess it comes to like a deeper point of like, where in like the evolutionary like tree, I guess, do you start to see that trait emerge versus where do you not? Because there are still, I understand, a lot of animals, even like very highly evolved animals, that don't like hunt in packs, for example. So yeah, I wonder if there's like a really interesting deep dive, or if this is still like a breaking ground for science somewhere where we're still trying to track down exactly where that originates from.
Well, my guess would be that it probably didn't just originate once. Like, I would guess this is probably one of those traits, like having wings or having eyes or something, or being able to swim, that's just going to reappear over and over just because it's just obviously advantageous for like a maybe not for every animal to have, because there's different ecological niches. Like, not every animal needs to hunt in packs, but it's just like there are obvious advantages to some animals of doing it, right? Like, if you are one wolf, you probably can't take down a moose, but if you are 10 wolves, you probably can. And there's also just the safety in numbers thing, right? It's like like what is a predator going to be, is a predator gonna be more likely to come after one bee, or is it gonna be more likely to come after a beehive? Right? It just seems like the fact that there are so many of them is just an obvious deterrent to aggression.
Yeah, it reminds me of the distinction between like R type and K type reproduction, where scientists sort of have this distinction versus animals that have a lot of investment in single ones. Like the classic example is like a whale, where a whale has a single offspring and they guard that offspring. They move with them for a long period of time in order to guarantee that success. Or versus I believe it's then K type reproduction, where they just make lots and lots of offsprings, like insects, for example, and just sort of like off you go. And most of them will die and won't grow up because they're making so many. They're able to continue the species. It reminds me, I'm sure you've heard of the Tierzu YouTube channel. Yeah. He's sort of like, a really great example of sort of the way in which, just analyzing evolutionary traits and almost looking at it through the lens of like this like competition, this system of like trying to get success.
Mm-hmm. And humans, in case there were any doubt about it, are the kind that have few offspring but invest a lot in them, right? So if I try to tie that into the corruption thing, it like, I guess it makes some amount of sense to say that like if you're incentivized like instinctively, not to say that this necessarily is true, but if it's true that we're just instinctively incentivized or motivated to help those who are more closely related to us, or who are part of our in-group, that then of course it makes sense that those people might get preferential treatment in a political context, just like they would get in any other context, just because that's kind of the nature of the relationship, is that there's a transactional component to it, right? That in order to maintain that good relationship with somebody else, you kind of have to be doing favors back and forth, right? So I thought it was an interesting idea that that what we think of corruption might actually just be the norm, right? And like it's the absence of corruption that is the aberration that we're trying to enforce on these political systems, because we have ideals that don't actually match up all that well with with human biology or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen. There's this show called Psychopaths, and it's this anime or whatever. The characters are detectives trying to solve murders and stuff. And one of the characters says, we don't start until there's a body. In that way, we've sort of already lost before we've begun. And it reminds me a lot of the like structures in our society and stuff. We're really fighting against a lot of human nature, trying to like put up everything. And I think it's very easy easy to sometimes take for granted and forget the context, man. Like most of human history, we weren't even remotely close to being able to be this good about like a civil society with laws and, you know, equal rights before the laws and, you know, having meritocracy. So yeah, it's not to say that we shouldn't pursue that, but sometimes it's important to keep that in mind when we talk about, you know, some of these problems are so hard to solve.
Yeah, and another thing I want to add to that, like even if it's a hard problem to solve, and even if it goes against human nature, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's impossible, right? Like there are other things like that we've succeeded at decently well. Like we've definitely reduced the rates of violence in our societies compared to historical societies, but by a lot. Like if you look at the historical crime rates or like I guess murder rates are mainly what I'm thinking of here. Like of hunter-gatherer societies, and then of like early agricultural societies, and then medieval and so on. There's a very noticeable downward trend in the rate at which people get murdered. Right, there are some hunter-gatherer societies where like 60% of all deaths are murders. I looked into that recently. That's like on the high end, where like on the low end, some of the hunter-gatherer society, the low end is like 2% of all deaths are murders, right? Whereas in the United States, it's like 1 out of every like 12,000 or so, or like I think maybe it's like 1,200. No, it's like 12,000 if I remember right. It's like a tiny fraction of 1%, right? There definitely is some kind of instinctive human tendency towards like aggression and violence towards others. That that's not to say that that's that humans are just inherently violent and that's characteristic of the way we are, but that is part of the way that we are, and so there is kind of an uphill battle to suppress that in order to have a relatively peaceful civilized society. And so that's a battle that we'll never completely win, but it is a battle that we can make a lot of incremental progress on, and that we have made a lot of incremental progress on. And I think the same thing could be true for nepotism, corruption, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you'll continue to work with them in this kind of quid pro quo, you scratch my back, I scratch yours way, what we call direct reciprocity. So if you screw me over, I know who you are, and I can come get you. Right? If you help me, likewise, I can help you in return. So that explains why we work with people we regularly interact with. You can build that a little bit further if you build in reputation, what we call indirect reciprocity. So I might not know you directly, but if you screw me over, I'll tell other people about you. And similarly, if you help people, they'll tell people about you. And I can conditionally choose to work with you because I've heard good things, or conditionally choose to avoid you because I've heard bad things. So if a manager were to, instead of going through the normal human resource processes for recruitment, were to give a friend a job, or a friend of a friend, we call that cronyism. But actually, from the perspective of, let's say, biology, it's just direct or indirect reciprocity, again, undermining our meritocratic institutions.
Where do you sort of place greed? Is financial gain not necessarily the big driver that we might think?
I mean, I think it's more that self-interest is ever present, but it's not the cause of these things. It's just part of the framework. Humans work in competition with one another for status, for money, for resources, and so on, right? But that's always true, whether you're in a very corrupt place or whether you're in a place that's not very corrupt. The difference is, what are the range of things that I'm allowed to do in order to get what I want for me and mine? Right? I mean, norms do play a part here. So there's work, for example, by Raj Chetty that shows that one of the big predictors of whether you will engage in tax loopholes is not whether it's beneficial to you, right? That's always true. Like it might always be beneficial to you, but it's whether your neighbors are doing it. So you discover that A, you can get away with it, and B, how to do it. Right? If you don't have that information, then you might never think to do that, because you don't know what the probability is that you're going to get caught. So it's I think people have the tendency to go, look at Wall Street, look at how greedy they are. But it's not the greed per se. Humans are humans. And let me link that to this other idea that people often think about corruption as being kind of isolated at the top end of society. Right? There's this feeling like, look at our leaders, look at what the prime minister has done, look at what the president has done, look at what these ministers have done. If only we could select the right people, then there would be no corruption anymore. But actually, from this perspective, those kinds of behaviors that we call corrupt are ever present throughout the society, right? So yes, it's the prime minister who gives his brother a position in parliament, but equally, it's the visa officer who gives his friend a quicker pathway through the line so you can get your visa sorted out more quickly. It's the shopkeeper who gives his niece a job. You know, those kinds of behaviors, this tendency to favor your family and friends. These are kind of two big drivers, nepotism and cronyism. They're present throughout the society. So the question is, where do you draw the line?
Jonathan Weigel, Assistant Professor of International Development at LSE, agrees that at the most basic level, corruption stems from one of our most basic instincts.
I think
it reminds me of an argument I've sort of had with friends is the level of discretionality at in law enforcement in the United States sometimes can be a real source of problems. The idea that, you know, at so many levels, someone can kind of based on a vibe check decide, I decided to let you go. It's okay. And on the one hand, when you initially think about that, it sounds like, oh, that's a good thing, right? We want to let people off the hook. Sometimes we want to allow the human, you know, we want to allow that human judgment to, you know, sometimes massage the laws a little bit. But on the other hand, you can say the danger when that's then unequally applied. So yeah, it's super fascinating, the sort of unintended consequences of things like that.
Yeah, I think this is like actually a rather like significant contributor that people rarely talk about to the like systemic racism thing. And not even just in policing, but like, although probably also in policing, but the way I was thinking of it was like the generational wealth thing, right? Like if or like in hiring practices also, like if like a lot of people get their jobs through nepotism, just through their connections with family and friends. And of course, like if white people own most of the businesses and they they give preferential treatment to their family and friends who are mostly also white, then they could like be effectively behaving in a racist way, even if the intention is just I favor my family and friends rather than intentionally discriminating against other groups.
It's human nature to try to improve your lot. It's human nature to try to help out your kin. And these are deeply embedded in our cultures, maybe in our DNA. I think primatologists have studied this quite a bit, and you do find, for example, in Francis Fukuyama's recent books, he talks about sort of how deeply rooted sort of kin favoritism is, and so I think it is fundamental, and there's a process of institutionalization, this is again Fukuyama's word, where societies try to create constraints on individual behavior to reduce those temptations to help your kin or to, take a little money on the side. And that process of institutionalization sort of occurs over the course of history and as states develop and build more capacity. But it's always sort of a back and forth. And there can be a process of institutional decay where these fundamental kind of, I think, very rational human responses to institutions to try to better your lot and to try to help your kin will resurface because humans are creative and technologies change and institutions change. So I think it's always going to be a bit of a back and forth between the process of creating institutions to put constraints on behavior and this pretty hardwired desire to better your lot and favor your kin.
What's the danger for countries if they don't really start to tackle corruption?
I would say that it means that the state will be deprived of resources, and there's another almost more pernicious failure of governance, which is when agents in the center expect corruption in the periphery or at a lower level of government, and so then they don't even try to implement some project because you just expect that the people further down the chain are just going to take all the money. And so you get kind of a failure of imagination or a failure of expectations. that's really pernicious, because if, that really is more about your perception in the center of what other people will be doing in the first place.
That reminds me a lot of, oh man, I wish I could find, I need to find this article again. There's a great article about American bureaucracy and the uniquely inefficient nature of American bureaucracy compared to other bureaucracies, and the way in which we don't trust sometimes a lot of government processes. So we make all these rules and regulations and processes that are far more, burdensome than they otherwise would be, which then makes the process more inefficient. So we trust it less. So we put more rules and more regulations and more process in, which makes it even more inefficient. It's just this vicious cycle of we don't trust it, so we put a lot of rules on it. Those rules make it worse, so we trust it even less, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
That's interesting, but I could imagine it going totally the other way around. It's like, well, we have so many rules on people that now we can trust that they won't misbehave because the rules are keeping them in check, and it would increase trust in the system.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, I wish I had the article right in front of me, because it did a really good job going into like specific examples of the ways in which these rules specifically lowered trust in these institutions. But yeah, it was really interesting. I'll have to see if I can find that.
Another thing that I was thinking of just now while listening to this, there's a book, a famous book by Peter Singer, who's a moral philosopher, and his book is called The Expanding Circle. And the idea is like you have kind of like a circle of moral concern. It's like, who do you consider to be your in-group versus your out-group, right? And so his thesis is that humans would first consider themselves and then their immediate family and friends to be part of their in-group, but then as you get societies that kind of expand, into more modern times, you would generally get people considering, like, they might consider their entire nation to be part of their in-group, or they might consider all of humanity to be part of their in-group. And it makes me think, like, if your goal is just to show favoritism to your family and friends, it's like, it's going to be very important where you draw the line for who do you consider a family and friend, right? Because if, like, loyalty to your nation is the way that you go about expressing your favoritism to family and friends, then I think that would not necessarily result in the type of corruption that we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing with that is it sort of goes back to that evolutionary point, which is how does the evolutionary system implement on a biological level that preference, and where does it then draw those lines? Like the way that, like, empathy we think of as a very human emotion, but there are lots of examples where humans don't have enough empathy, right? Throughout our history, horrible war crimes. So how is that specifically expressed is sort of then what dictates like the lines of like the most common forms of corruption.
Yeah, and it seems like people are flexible about it, though, right? It doesn't. I mean, this is I'm no social scientist or whatever, but this is just the way it appears to me. Is that the people don't seem to have like a single instinctive definitive answer to who they consider their in group and who they don't. It seems like this is a learned thing that this person is one of us and this person isn't. Yeah, I don't know.
I think the biggest issues here are that the government then cannot step in to do certain very needed jobs that the government has to do. We need governments for certain key tasks, right? We need them to settle disputes. We need governments to provide certain public goods, to reduce certain externalities. That's just the very minimum set of things that we expect governments to do. There's a larger set of things that we think governments may want to do, but that sort of depends on your views. So I don't want to necessarily go there. But I think the key thing here is that corruption, it renders toothless the government in its quest to, actually provide some kind of adjudication of contracts and to provide public goods and to redress those externalities, right? So every piece of what the government could and should be doing is then rendered less effective.
Michael is also clear about the potential damage corruption can do to society.
If you want your governments to work, if you want people to be voting not for their clan as a group, but voting for their own interests, if you want a democracy in that way, then you have to suppress these kind of kind of tendencies. Now, it's a tricky thing, right? The devil's in the details. The places where you rely on your friends and family are also the places in which the state is weak. And so you can't rely on the government to help you. You have to rely on your friends and family. But that, in turn, undermines the potential of the government to provide goods for its citizens. So it's this tricky and difficult balance between these two forces.
In his paper, Corrupting Cooperation and How Anti-Corruption Strategies May Backfire, Michael and his co-authors use the public goods game to understand how the dynamics between cooperation and corruption might operate. I asked him to explain.
Often it's nice to kind of take in the world and all of its complexity and have a stylized version of that captures what we think is the essence of the dilemma that people face. And so this has been done using what's called a public goods game. So you can think about this as kind of taxes, something in which we all pay into and then we all benefit from equally. So clean air, clean water, the roads that, in the UK, at the NHS, for example. So we take a public goods game. Now the question is, how do we sustain cooperation? What is a public goods game? Let me go back for a second. Let's say there's 10 players. I'm going to give each of them £10, and then they can put whatever they want from 0 to 10 into a central pool, and I'm going to multiply that pool by some amount, and then I'm going to redistribute it to everybody equally. This is the key, equally. So if there's 10 people, and let's say I'm going to multiply it by 3, then it's in everyone's best interest to put all of that money into that central pool. So if 10 people put 10 into the pool, and I multiply that by 3, now it's 300, I divide it up, now you go home with 30. But the thing is that it's in your best interest to not put anything in there, to not pay any taxes, have everyone else pay the taxes to sustain this. And if you're alone in doing that, right, let's say you put 0 in and everyone else puts 10 in, you're going to get something closer to £40, and everyone else is going to get less than 30. So what happens when you play this game with people is that initially they play at whatever the norm is in their society. So they'll maybe give 50% of whatever they have, right? But as they play it over and over again, they realize that just by putting a little bit less, they can be better off, and eventually people are putting effectively nothing. So the puzzle is, what can we introduce into this stylized version of the world to sustain people's contributions? All kinds of things so people use, for example, peer punishment. So you allow people to punish one another if they don't.
It's getting really intense.
And this gets you to a certain, it gets you so far. But eventually you run into the problem of second-order free riding.
In social sciences, the free rider problem occurs when a person, the free rider, puts strain on the system by not paying for the resources, public goods or services that he or she is benefiting from. While punishment can lead people to cooperate more, in this case pay their fair share, it costs to put effective systems in place. What to do when the leader decides to let the offender off instead? One option is to punish them for opting not to punish the offenders, but this can create what is called a second-order free rider problem. And who wants to pay the cost of telling off people who don't tell people off? So this alone isn't enough to scale up cooperation. Back to Michael.
It's costly to punish somebody, then you want someone else to do it. One very successful way to get cooperation off the ground is to set up an institution. You just select one person and say, you're going to be the leader, and you can extract taxes from everybody else and use those taxes to punish whomever you want. And what previous work has shown is that the stronger you make that leader, so the more powerful you make that leader in terms of the multiplier on those taxes, the larger a group you can sustain and the more contributions you can sustain.
To understand how different types of cooperation might impact on people's behaviour, Michael introduced the idea that, in addition to deciding what to contribute to the central pot and what to keep for themselves, players could also offer some of their money to the game's leader.
We didn't, of course, introduce anything like bribery. We didn't say anything like that, but that's effectively what it was. And the leader, in turn, could do their usual thing of, punishing or not punishing, or they could accept that little contribution. And then what we found was the opposite result. So the stronger you make the leader, the weaker the public good contributions. So what they end up using that power for is to extract more money for themselves. Because if you do the math, even without doing the math, if you just think about it for a second, the amount of money that they can make by extracting just a little bit from every player is much larger than the amount of money that they could make by making the country or the public good work more effectively. So we've introduced bribery into it, and it
The other, I think, really pernicious thing about that he doesn't exactly spell out is that if you're only stealing 5 cents from every person, no one person has a significant motivation to go after you because they're all losing such a small amount. Even though in the net you could be stealing thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands, depending upon how wide that pool is. So that's another point of asymmetry: is there's no single actor with enough equal investment against stopping this corruption as you have for doing the corruption. Everyone else stands to lose 5 cents. You stand to gain $1,000. So you're obviously going to be working a lot harder.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point for why it would make sense to for in large institutions particularly, but for that type of thing to happen. I think that would be much less true, and if in a small business if there's corruption or something. But yeah. Another thing I was thinking about just now, I was recently hearing about some studies where I guess these are probably not anything new, but these are like I don't know if they'd be like behavioral economics or some kind of social science study where people were surveyed about, like, would you rather work at a company where you make $50,000 but everyone else makes 40, or would you rather work at a company where you make $100,000 but everyone else makes 120? And it would, like, to me this just seems like an easy question. It's like, well, I'd rather make more money. Like, what, like, why do I care that much? Like, but that's not how people answer.
It's, oh my gosh, I just can't imagine. Like, it's so foreign to me, but lots of people do think that's why.
Yeah, but I think that type of mentality, like, it goes a long way towards explaining like this type of corruption, right? Because if your priority is not just to be like better off in some like neutral, quote unquote objective sense, but if your priority is instead to just put yourself ahead of other people, then it makes a lot of sense that you will do behaviors that will like hurt the system but benefit yourself, and even if it's like because you would think like the incentive should be fairly obvious that like we all want to live in a well functioning society, and if you behave in a way that's not corrupt, you are contributing to the kind of society that you want to live in, right? So that's that kind of ideal. But and that's, I think the person who believes in that kind of ideal is the person who chooses the $100,000, right? But the person who instead just wants to be ahead of everyone else is the person who goes like, no, I'll take the 50 if I can have everyone else be at 40.
Yeah.
Minds everything.
Transparency is often hailed as an important tool to tackle corruption. Michael found, however, that under some conditions, transparency actually increased the rates of bribery. I asked him why he thought that was.
What we wanted to show is that a lot of the kind of intuitive anti-corruption strategies that people do apply in the world, it comes from a place, from what we call weird psychology, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic psychology, which is very different to the rest of the world. It relies on things like norms that say that actually this kind of behavior that this person is engaging in is bad, and you shouldn't be doing it. Not a world in which actually the problem is not that the prime minister gave his brother a contract. It's that anyone, most people in this society would do the same thing in those circumstances. Because you're supposed to be there for your family. You're supposed to be there for your friends. Okay, so what we did was we introduced transparency into the game. We introduced full transparency so that everything is anonymous but still visible. And what we found was that, that actually did work so we ran this study among Canadians. And we found that if the multiplier in the public good was sufficiently large, or the leader had sufficient power to be punishing others, then actually that transparency worked in the Canadian context. If we played this in Cameroon, we might have gotten a different answer because the baseline for that corruption might have been higher. And so in the condition in which the multiplier in the public good was low, and the ability of the leader to punish, free.
I want to point out that here I don't think he's accusing Cameroon of being like some horrible evil like den of corruption. I think his point is just that people in Cameroon probably have a higher expectation that you're supposed to look out for your family and your own people, and that's supposed to be like your highest priority. So then if they see somebody enriching themselves at the expense of the public in government, they're probably a little more tolerant of it because it's like, well, they're just doing what everyone would do, which is to look out for themselves and their own family.
Writers was weak. then actually transparency did the opposite. It increased the amount of bribery that was taking place and reduced the amount of contributions. And you say, well, why would transparency do that? The reason is that it solved a different problem. In that world in which the economic potential, this multiplier, wasn't high enough, and the leaders just don't have the power to be, to be fighting all corruption, if you like, then actually the correct move is to engage in bribery in our game, and perhaps the correct move is to help your family, is to help your friends, right? The puzzle in terms of bribery is not should I be engaging in bribery, it's how much do I pay? So transparency solved a different puzzle. It revealed that everybody was engaging in bribery, and it told you the price of the bribe. And so it made bribery more efficient. And so these intuitions don't always take us to the right place, and that's why I think these kinds of theoretical frameworks are very useful for addressing these problems.
As Michael's findings show, decisions over the right course of action can be impacted by our environment. One difficulty in tackling
bribery under some circumstances. That's totally unintuitive because it seems like usually whenever people talk about corruption, they immediately go to we need more transparency as the antidote to this. But I would be really interested to know more about that. Like, what is the range of applicability of this? Because like if it's true that transparency actually does more harm than good, that seems like it should be a very valuable thing to know when we're deciding what our policies should be with regard to corruption.
The issue is that behaviour that might appear unethical or even be illegal in one country could appear simply pragmatic to those living in another. I asked Michael what role culture plays in the way we view the issue.
What is corruption? And honestly, what is the difference between lobbying and bribery? One's institutionalized and legal, but they're very close to the same thing. So I'm less interested in labeling something, except insofar as it's helpful to fight it, if you like. But I am interested in its effects. And so what I suspect is the case is that the absolute amount, the cost of corruption, that absolute cost, is higher in a Western society. And that's simply because the Western society is wealthier. But the relative cost is higher in those poorer countries. And so it's felt more acutely. So to quote from the paper, the difference in a Western country might be the difference between 40 hospitals and 30 hospitals. That's a difference of 10, right? But in a poor country, it might be the difference between 3 hospitals and no hospitals, or 3 hospitals and 1 hospital. A smaller absolute difference, right? Like 2 or 3 versus 10, but relative terms, a massive difference. So yeah, I do think that there are massive inefficiencies due to the corruption in our own nations, but we just don't feel them. Life is pretty good, actually. We're all doing pretty well.
Sandra Sequeira, an assistant professor in development economics at LSE, also stresses that corruption isn't just a developing world issue.
We tend to think about the developing world as just culturally being more open to corruption. This is how things are done, and it's a bit inevitable. That's not something that I have found in my research in particular. I mean, when I first approached this, I was thinking that corruption can exist anywhere. And more often than not, when I talked about corruption in Africa, I would be told, you don't have to go that far. You can find corruption in certain ports in the US and certain ports in Europe. So I think it's quite pervasive at all levels. There's going to be a lot of heterogeneity and differences across sectors, depending again on institutional capability, the ability for a state to monitor bureaucrats, the incentives that can be given to bureaucrats, the technology available to try to detect corruption and document corruption so that you can act on it. And so naturally developing countries are usually going to have a harder time because they sometimes don't have the technology and they don't have the state capacity to be able to monitor, to reward honest bureaucrats and to punish dishonest or corrupt bureaucrats. But again, I don't think it's a problem that's confined to the developing world at all, and that's what we're finding, as you were saying, that it can be more pervasive than that.
Sandra's research into corruption has taken her to Africa. Her work has examined the impact that corruption can have on the decision making.
I thought that was a really interesting point that was made about people reacting to corruption differently when they feel like things are going fine. Because it makes a lot of sense to me that if you feel like your country's, or you and your family are basically doing okay, then you're probably not actually that worried about corruption, right? It's like, well, this isn't hurting me that much. But on the other hand, you could also say that if you feel like things are going fine and corruption doesn't matter that much, then maybe you'll be less motivated to do corruption also, right? Like if you feel like the financial position of your own family is secure, then it's going to be harder to justify to yourself that I need this money more than the treasury does.
Yeah, it reminds me of sort of in a way, a sort of disturbing part of human psychology. It's funny, it reminds me of the other things we talked about, where an initially good thing, the ramifications end up being bad. Humans are really good at adapting to situations, even really horrible situations. Like if you look at, for example, like the Warsaw Ghetto, the fact that there was really only one serious uprising attempt, or, if you look at, like, for example, the suicide rates in concentration camps was actually relatively low. Like, utterly insane to think about. Humans are really good at adapting to things and just, hanging up a picture. There's this great saying: when most people get stuck in a ditch or in a rut, they hang up a picture. They make it comfortable. In authoritarian nations, places like China or Cuba, where there absolutely are really bad conditions, most people are actually, if they're able to put food on the table and live relatively okay lives, a lot of times they're willing to go along with it. It reminds, most of the time when you see these big protest movements, for example, in Iran recently, or in Cuba a couple of years ago, right as COVID was beginning, I believe, these protests, there wasn't huge change in the underlying conditions of this authoritarian regime. The economic quality of life went down. And for a lot of people, especially in China, this is a very real phenomenon that scholars talk about, who are a lot smarter than me, talk about how, there's this understanding among, the middle to upper Chinese middle class that, it's okay, we're willing to sacrifice some of these freedoms and political liberties if it means better economic results. But when those results start to come down, then people start to have a real problem with the underlying authoritarian conditions, which actually haven't changed. It's something really fascinating.
I have a friend who lives in Eastern Europe, and I've had a bunch of talks with him about, like, what is the political culture like of Eastern Europe, and what I've gathered from it is that it's a lot less idealistic than Western political culture, and in a way you could say it's more cynical, because they kind of do just believe that corruption is inevitable, but also they kind of don't care as much, right? That like for one thing, a lot of those countries are like not very democratic, and they sort of believe it's not my problem. It's the government is not of the people, by the people, for the people, or whatever we're supposed to believe in America. They're just like, it's some people over there. They'll do their thing, and I'll do my thing. But then another thing about their expectations is that they just have they kind of just believe that the job of the government is just like mainly to keep them safe and keep food on the table, and it's like as long as there's not like war or a huge amount of crime or some kind of like complete economic disaster, they sort of feel like that's fine, and I don't care what else is going on. Whatever corruption is going on in the background is just way less important to me than those things. And in the West, I think we a lot of times just take those things for granted, right? Like we in the United States have not lived through a war in our lifetime, right? And we've lived through bad economic times, but like bad relative to us, right? Not bad in like mass starvation and millions of people dying, right? It's just a different benchmark that we have for the conditions that we're supposed to live under.
Making of organisations or firms. Sandra focused on the operations of two ports, Durban in South Africa and the more corrupt port of Maputo in Mozambique. I asked her what her findings revealed.
So the South African ports had a system where if you wanted to ship anything through the border and through the port, you would have to submit the documentation online. So you wouldn't be interacting face-to-face with a customs agent. Whereas in Maputo, at the time of the study, that was not the case. And so the moment you have to interact face-to-face, there's a lot of conversations and a lot of collusion going on, so that you can pay bribes. So we found that because corruption was much higher and much more uncertain in one of the ports, so in the port in Mozambique, that there was a large amount of firms in South Africa who were going the long way around in order to ship through a less corrupt port.
This is reminding me of something we talked about a few weeks ago. You remember we were watching there was a podcast or an academic lecture or whatever it was where these like conservative people were talking about that they feel like left out of social media, that they feel like a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Whatever, like the policing of social media was not.
The moderation, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, moderation. Thank you. And the point that the guy was making on there on that show was he said like it feels like there's a bunch of individual people at YouTube or Google that just have it out for me, and at the time I heard that and I was like, wow, that seems like the exact opposite complaint of what I normally hear about YouTube moderation, where it's like I can't even get in touch with a person, and normally people are just complaining about how everyth's done by robots, right? But yeah. It sort of feels like the complaint that he was making is similar to what's being said here about like when you are dealing face to face with another person like this, there is an opportunity for these kind of things to happen under the table that wouldn't be the case under a more like structured rule-based system, which is presumably what like a YouTube algorithm would be. I don't know. What do you make of that comparison?
I think people are really bad at correctly identifying the source of the problem they are dealing with sometimes. There are problems with automated systems, and there are problems where it's just a robot, and there are problems with in-person moderation. I think like Twitch would be a great example of that, where it seemed like there was really inconsistent application based on individual people having a lot of agency. And the problem is that instead, people throw the baby out with the bathwater. Oh, this automated algorithm messed up. We need to not have so many automated algorithms. We need more humans. Oh, this human messed up. I want a fair YouTube algorithm.
That's true.
Yeah. It's like, oh God, what's the famous Henry Ford quote? Like, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. Like, there's a real problem trying to identify what are the alternatives available, what are those paths, and then comparing them. The overreaction and just sort of like throwing this out and trying something new is a really big problem. And it means that we don't get iterations, because the way you improve things is not by not doing them, it's by doing them again and trying to get better. It's similar to green energy, right? So much time was spent in the early 2000s, and even still today, even though it's total bullshit now, saying like solar is awful, it's horrible, so we shouldn't do it. And it's like, if you want solar to be better, we should be trying to use it more to iterate and develop, right? Like, we wouldn't have the amazing cars we had today if when we first made cars, we're like, these aren't good enough, let's get rid of them. So like recognizing where a system or a technology has room to grow and iterate on is really, really important, and it's not something that people think about a lot.
Yeah, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense about the psychology of the complaint. What do you make of the idea that one or the other of these ways of doing business might be like, air quotes, objectively more prone to corruption? That like the face-to-face one that empowers individual people versus the more like structured rule-based system where individuals have less leeway in their judgment.
I don't know. It feels like there's so many points of failure in both that it's gonna be a larger question. It's gonna be like a context dependent question where it's like, do we have faith in being able to get people out? Do we have faith in the system in this particular area? I'm reminded Al Capone and the Untouchables. The local law enforcement there was so untrustworthy that they had to bring in these outside forces, and that's what sometimes happen. Sometimes the FBI, there are like documents that the FBI has where sometimes like, listen, sometimes we don't work with this, local police departments because we're concerned about a certain level of infiltration or corruption there. Versus the opposite can absolutely happen. Sometimes the people on the ground really are trying to do their best and are trying to help, but unfortunately, or rather, the system is trying to do its best, but then the individual agents, on the ground are being corrupted and aren't trustworthy. So it feels like it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There has to be like a holistic evaluation of a case by case.
Yeah, I sort of feel like that's probably true if the question is like which one of these things is best holistically. But I mean, I guess like my intuition on this is that the system that leans more on the judgment of individual humans, I would guess probably will be more susceptible to corruption, but then it'll probably be less susceptible to some other problems that you would run into from having an inflexible system that just comes across some situation that it wasn't built for and I don't know, runs itself into the ground. So maybe like I'm not sure that one of these is that these things are equally bad in terms of corruption, but I wonder if like there might be a trade-off between like one of these is more lenient, on corruption, but has other benefits, and the other is less lenient on corruption, but at a cost of inflexibility.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what firms' understanding was that there was a lot of uncertainty. They never knew when they would have to pay a bribe, and that created all sorts of complications in the transport system, because they would have to give some extra pocket money to the intermediaries who are moving goods across borders and across the port without knowing if that money was going to be used to pay a bribe or not. And that type of uncertainty just created this narrative that you have to grease too many hands to go through the Maputo port. Therefore, we're going to risk congestion, longer travel, and higher transportation costs just in order to ship through a less corrupt port. So I think that the main takeaway is that corruption can distort people's decisions. The alternative story would be that corruption is just a tax that you pay, but it doesn't really change your decisions. You just have to pay a bit more to get things done, but it doesn't change ultimately the way you behave. And here I could show that firms actually did change massively their behavior just because of corruption.
Your findings were used to basically improve the anti-corruption policies in Mozambique. So what changes did they make to try and reduce the problem?
What happened was that they introduced a technology that already existed in South Africa in the port of Mozambique.
Sandra's referring here to the implementation of a system called the electronic single window. This was introduced in Mozambique after she provided evidence that Maputo's competitor, the Port of Durban, had reduced their instances of corruption by using an online system to submit clearance documentation.
And the general understanding is that reduced corruption significantly. I went back about 6 months later, and the data did suggest that there were far fewer bribes being paid. So I think an interesting takeaway of this study is that, sometimes we often think about corruption as being part of people's culture, that is something very slow moving, that is very hard to change, when in fact, when you have the right...
How do you think they're gathering data on how many bribes are paid? My guess would be that they're probably asking people, did you have to pay a bribe to do business at this port? But
that's really interesting. Yeah, I'm so curious. I don't know. And maybe it could be, I know that in some cases, I know that sometimes with corruption, I don't know if this happens all the time, but I know that there are sometimes cases where corruption takes the form of official fees, and you can sort of see like this is the average level of fees, and then these are spikes, and most of these spikes are going to be corruption of people tacking on fees corruptly.
Maybe there's some like aggregate way of doing it. It's like this economic system is supposed to have this much money in it, but instead it has this much money in it, and we're going to assume that the difference is due to corruption. I don't know if it's that or if it's like surveying people. I could see either one.
Context and the right institutional setting, you can actually change things. So in this case, it was a change in technology. It was a change in context as well, because as the country introduced other forms of taxation, such as value-added tax, that is more profitable for the government to get revenues, there was less interest in getting revenues from tariffs. Tariffs were also going down at the time, and so these corruption costs at the port became far less important for customs. And so I think it's a combination of people's incentives and the technology that reduced corruption.
Of course, change can be difficult wherever it is made, but one imagines especially so when someone benefiting from the current system will lose out as a result. I asked Sandra how the changes to operations in Mozambique have been received and how you change the behavior of those benefiting from current operations.
Right, that is a very big challenge. I think in this case, we were helped by a lot of factors. So one, as I said, the corruption or the bribes were being paid mostly to evade tariffs. At the time of the study, tariffs were coming down significantly because the country had signed a trade agreement with regional partners, and so tariffs were coming down to zero. So that was already reducing the ability for bureaucrats to extract bribes from agents and from firms. So I think that changed their incentives, and also the fact that there were international institutions, so the World Bank and the IMF, who were putting pressure for trade costs to be reduced in the region. And so there was a general awareness at the government level that this type of petty corruption had to be cleaned up. So I suppose that's what you need incentives at a higher level to clean this up, and also changing people's choice sets at the more micro level so that bureaucrats have less of an incentive to extract bribes.
Creating the right conditions to reduce extortion when one party is benefiting is difficult. But what about when both parties gain something from the transaction? Jonathan Weigel has been studying bribery at roadway tolls in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In order to understand the incentives of those paying bribes, motorcycle taxi drivers were offered their money back if they were to pay the toll booth tax instead of the more usual bribe. I asked him what this experiment revealed.
So we wanted to understand the citizen side of corruption. There's been a lot more research on what I would say is sort of the government side of corruption. Top-down audits, policies like that. We were interested in understanding whether you could intervene on the citizen side and whether that might be a way, a potential policy tool to reduce corruption. And then before long, we realized, well, we need to understand why citizens pay bribes in the first place. So what are the different potential motivations that an average citizen might have in paying a government bureaucrat? And so I think there's a few that come to mind. One is, well, they don't have a choice. They're just being shaken down. So this is sort of outright extortion. So we're not going to look at that because that's not really the question we're interested in. We're interested in situations where the citizen does have some discretion and is actually choosing to pay a bribe instead of paying, for example, the full tax or the full price for a service. So the other options, I think, are, well, this lowers the financial cost of whatever service they were trying to get. Or it could also lower the time cost. It could speed things up. Or finally, it could be some kind of psychic cost story where an absence of what we call tax morale is present, and that means I don't pay any kind of psychic cost for paying a bribe. So we wanted to find a setting where we could study the importance of these different factors. And the DRC is one of the sort of most thought to be the most corrupt countries in the world, according to cross-country data on perceptions of corruption. So we thought that would be an interesting place to look at this. And we wanted to find a setting where citizens are paying frequent bribes. So the norm is to pay bribes, because then we could look at, okay, what happens when you try to change their incentives a little bit? And we worked with a population of motorcycle taxi drivers who are passing through the city's tolls sometimes multiple times per day, but at least a couple times per week. And each time they go through the toll, they have a chance to bribe the toll collector or to pay the full tax. If they pay the full tax, they get a receipt. And we know that all the money that gets a receipt does, in fact, make it to the government. We sort of tracked that. So then the question was, what can we incentivize drivers to bring us receipts more often, showing that they're actually shifting from paying bribes into paying the full toll tax. Before the experiment, only about 12% of people were paying the full tax. Okay, so almost 90% of the drivers were paying bribes. So there's a lot of room to potentially change behavior here. And so what we wanted to do is then provide some kind of incentive. So we provided both financial incentives and what we called social incentives. I'll just focus on the financial incentives because I think it's sort of the most clear. We offer to fully reimburse you if you bring us a receipt proving that you paid the tax and not a bribe, or we will offer you a 50% reimbursement.
Jonathan estimates that around 30% of motorcycle drivers in his study were incentivized to pay the tax instead of the bribe as a result.
And that's, again, pretty large. But I think the question always remains, how come the remaining 70% are paying bribes instead, even when we're fully reimbursing the cost of their toll? That's kind of the puzzle that emerges from this. And this is true of a lot of corruption papers. Even if you see, or corruption studies, I should say, just in general, even if you see a pretty large response, often the level of behavior, of sort of bribery in our case, or other types of corruption, still stays relatively high. And so I think this suggests that the pure kind of financial cost motivation is not the only one. We need to think about other aspects of why citizens are supplying bribes in this case.
I asked Jonathan if part of their reluctance to change was because the payment was viewed as just a normal part of doing business.
Yeah, so is it just something everyone does is kind of the psychic cost piece of this. So if you're in some kind of an equilibrium where bribe payment's common, no one's getting punished, then why would anyone feel any kind of sense of guilt or shame if they pay a bribe, right? So that's kind of the low equilibrium. And then the question is always, how do you shift to a different world, a different equilibrium, where now you have low rates of corruption, high psychic costs. You actually do feel shame when you pay a bribe or you participate in some way in a corrupt transaction, and then actually high detection and punishment probabilities. So that's always the key question as we're kind of thinking about how to move from the one equilibrium to the other. In our setting, we think the most likely explanation for the remaining 70% of people who are not choosing to respond to this sort of offer of fully reimbursing their toll cost, we think it has to do with the time cost element. So that was one of the other reasons why a citizen might choose to pay a bribe, because it facilitates, it speeds up whatever kind of service or transaction they're engaging in.
So the bureaucracy sort of side is quite...
I remember when we were watching the Perun video, a point that he made was that sometimes if you have a system where corruption is really widespread, then people who don't participate in the corruption are viewed with suspicion, right?
That is a threat, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's it's a threat because it's like, are you going to undermine what all of us are doing? Are you a threat to the benefits that all of us are getting, or are you even like taking sides against us in some kind of like moral sense, right? So I would guess that that's probably a big part of the reason why these people don't want to do it is because they sort of feel like they'd be betraying their friends and family and neighbors and so on, if they were to participate in some act that implicitly morally condemns all of those people.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting the way in which the system becomes self-reinforcing. And yeah, I'd be more curious. That initial study he had is really good. I'd be more curious seeing that play out over a longer period of time to see if there's any pushback. Because of course the other thing, not just trying to get rid of corruption, but then there are going to be people trying to re-promote that corruption to find new ways, and they're going to have some degree of influence or control over the systems of government as well. So yeah, I'd be really interested to see a more long-term study on that as well.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting because we usually think of corruption as this kind of like antisocial behavior. It's like you're behaving against the norms of the society that you're living in. But if you're living in a society where corruption is the norm, that actually corruption might be like a pro-social behavior, and then so then it would make a lot of sense why it's like, oh, maybe it would just take a lot of time, like, years, or even like a generation or two to readjust those norms that to stop this corruption from happening.
Mm-hmm.
Quite heavy.
Exactly. Whenever there's some kind of a process that is slow or involves a hassle, then that's a common instance where you see incentives to pay bribes and to be corrupt. So in our specific situation, what we found when we did a little sort of qualitative field work in addition to our randomized experiment, which I was describing previously, was that these toll officers, they have this machine which they use to issue the receipts, but they don't keep it on them up at the toll. You have to basically walk down to this little hut, maybe 20 meters off the road, and you have to sit down, and they sort of go through and type up the receipt, but then they also copy everything down in this big ledger, which seems on the face of it pretty unnecessary. So in other words, they exaggerate the time cost in order, I think, to disincentivize the number of drivers who are going to ask for these things, because it just means you have to sit there for 5, 10, 15 minutes.
So they actually want to continue with the
exactly.
situation.
So this is kind of a response of the agents to the system that the government tried to put in there to reduce their discretion, to actually increase the amount of money that's making it to the government. But then, humans are humans. You're going to respond to your incentives, and the fact is, a lot of these officers, the money they lived on was coming from these sort of side payments, these bribes. So they then responded by making the overall time cost of this higher on the drivers. And so if you just look at actually what the amount of time that drivers report spending at the toll, it increases by 70% if you ask for a receipt. That's actually really costly, especially if you're a motor taxi driver, where you maybe have a passenger who's waiting for you, getting kind of frustrated, and you can see your tip going down, right? Or there's another customer who you're just not going to reach because it took that additional 12 minutes is sort of money wasted.
It seems clear that policymakers will need to understand both the reasons for demanding a bribe and giving one if they are to create the right conditions for change. I asked Sandra Sequeira if we needed to be far more targeted in trying to reduce corruption.
An important point to take away from these studies is that corruption is very, very context specific. So it really depends on you being able to identify who are the beneficiaries, how is corruption actually happen, what type of interactions between agents are happening, trying to document it, understand the magnitude of corruption as well, and understand how different anti-corruption strategies may play out in practice. So which ones are going to work best, which ones may backfire and make matters worse. So there are going to be tremendous differences between the type of petty corruption that I observed in the ports and perhaps corruption that you may find in health clinics, or that you may find in schools, or that you may find at a higher level in government. So this requires just a lot more research to understand the fundamentals of each corruption problem in different contexts.
So, is corruption inevitable?
Well, I suppose my thinking about this is that not necessarily that it's inevitable, but that it's important to document it as best we can. And then think about the trade-offs. So again, once you're able to understand the dynamics of corruption and understand the magnitude of its effects on society, so the economic and social or political costs of corruption, then the conversation becomes a bit easier as to thinking what are the type of anti-corruption strategies that we can try to design to fight this, how costly are those going to be, what is the likelihood of success of these anti-corruption strategies. And then you make decisions as to whether it's worth implementing them, or what is the minimum level of corruption that, the costs do not outweigh the cost of the anti-corruption strategy. So again, I would think much more about documenting it, understanding the real costs of corruption, the most obvious ones, but also the unintended ones, and then think about the costs associated with anti-corruption policies and just do that calculus and think about the trade-offs associated with them. I do think that there's something to be said about habit formation and social norms, is that it may be the norm that everyone pays a bribe and therefore you're going to pay a bribe too. But those norms can shift. And again, depending on the context, on the use of technology, changing people's incentives, people might respond. And so I suppose, to end on a positive note, is that if we devote enough energy and resources to try to understand the context, then we may be able to fix what we would otherwise think is unfixable.
Jonathan Weigel.
I think it is, in some way, it is inevitable because of these hardwired desires to better your lot and to favor your kin, and this process of this back and forth between the creation of institutions to put constraints on behavior and those fundamental human tendencies. There's always going to be a bit of a back and forth. I think all of the societies that have been very successful in expanding both the prosperity, the kind of economic well-being, but also the political freedoms and liberty of their people, have managed to construct states that have capacity, that limit corruption. That I think that's almost universally true among the very rich countries today. And so the question is that just sort of a luxury good, or is that actually part of the development process? My view is that state capacity is really important for development, and that actually, as policymakers and in thinking about some of the challenges that poorer countries face today, that understanding how to build more effective states that have less corruption and have better incentives for bureaucrats, so that you have less opportunities for bribe taking and for other forms of corruption. I do view that as a really important goal and part of the process of development more generally.
Finally, Michael Muthukrishna.
It's hard to say whether corruption is inevitable, but I would say that the trend toward corruption is always there. There is always a force pulling us toward corruption. I think which we are trying to suppress. You can call it corruption. We're trying to suppress lower order scales of cooperation so that we can work together at a higher scale. And that is becoming increasingly important because the kinds of problems that we face are at a higher scale. If we want to coordinate on things like corruption itself, but also on things like climate change or the protection of our borders or whatever, that requires us to cooperate at a higher scale. And so these lower order coalitional things, they make things more inefficient, but they also lead to goals and outcomes that are good for those smaller groups, the elite or tribes or whatever, at the expense of what would be better for all of us, at the expense of everybody contributing to that public good, maximally. So yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, you're trying to stamp this stuff out, but you do want to kind of suppress it as much as is possible.
Tell us what you think using the hashtag LSEIQ. I produced this episode of LSEIQ with Ollie Johnson, James Ratty, and Anna Bevan. Want to explore more about corruption? This episode was based in part on the following research: Corruption, Cooperation and the Evolution of Pro-Social Institutions by Michael Muthukrishna. Corrupting Cooperation and How Anti-Corruption Strategies May Backfire by Michael Muthukrishna, Patrick Francois, Cheyenne Purumadi and Joseph Henrich. An Empirical Study of Corruption in Ports by Sandra Siqueira and Simeon Jankov. And The Supply of Bribes, Evidence from Roadway Tolls in the Democratic Republic of the Congo by Otis Reed and Jonathan Weigel. Join us next time when we ask, are we doomed or can the climate crisis be averted? For more episodes of this podcast and to subscribe, please visit lse.ac.uk/IQ or search for LSEIQ in your favourite podcast app. And please consider leaving us a review, as this makes the podcast easier for new listeners to discover.
Well, that was really interesting. Like some of that the research they cited was great. It's great to have them not just sitting here giving opinions,
Yeah.
but actually like giving data that's relevant to the topic. I kind of didn't fully expect that, and then besides that, like a couple of really interesting findings, like the thing about like transparency not always being beneficial. I don't know. I really liked this podcast.
Yeah, I thought this was fantastic.
Do you have anything else you want to add? Or?
No, I'm super busy, so I'm about to go offline.
Oh, okay. Do you want to shout yourself out before we're done?
Yeah. Twitch.tv/Flowtrace, Twitter.com/Flowtrace, and also on Kick, kick.com/Flowtrace. I'm live every Wednesday here with Cricket, and I'm in and around panels. I'll see you all around.
All right. Thank you very much. See you around.
Yeah, I'll see you.